In October 1891, construction workers breaking ground for the new Hartford and Connecticut Western Railroad stumbled upon something that would haunt Connecticut for generations. Beneath the overgrown gardens of the abandoned Woodhaven estate in Millbrook, their shovels struck not rock or root, but human bone. What they unearthed that grey autumn morning was a mass grave containing the remains of 47 individuals, ranging from children as young as 6 to adults in their 30s. The Connecticut State Police immediately sealed the site, and within hours, Governor Luzon Morris issued an executive order classifying all findings as matters of state security. The official records were locked away, stamped with seals that remain unbroken to this day. Before we descend into this dark chapter of New England history, this story isn't for everyone. Only those brave enough to confront the most sinister truths about America's past should continue. If you're ready to join our community of truth seekers, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. We're building a global network of people who refuse to let these stories remain buried. The Woodhaven family had been pillars of Millbrook society for over 2 decades. Ezra Woodhaven, a man of imposing stature with piercing blue eyes and a carefully groomed beard, had arrived in the small Connecticut town in 1869 with his wife Constance and their 2 young children. He carried with him impeccable credentials as a minister and substantial financial resources that he claimed were inherited from his deceased father's shipping business in Boston. Within months of their arrival, the Woodhavens had purchased the largest estate in town, a sprawling Victorian mansion surrounded by 30 acres of pristine farmland and dense woodland. Ezra quickly established himself as a moral authority in the community. His Sunday sermons at the Millbrook Congregational Church drew crowds from neighboring towns, and his passionate speeches about Christian duty and charitable works inspired wealthy families throughout the region to open their purses for various causes. Constance, a woman of sharp intelligence and meticulous attention to detail, became the driving force behind the town's charitable organizations. She organized food drives for the poor, established a temporary housing program for travelers, and created what she called the Millbrook Sanctuary for Displaced Souls. The sanctuary was Constance's masterpiece, a program that promised to provide temporary shelter and employment opportunities for society's most vulnerable members. Orphan children, immigrant families struggling to find work, and traveling laborers who had fallen on hard times all found their way to the Woodhaven estate. The family's reputation for generosity spread throughout New England, and soon, desperate people were arriving at their door from as far away as New York and Massachusetts. Dr. Samuel Woodhaven, Ezra and Constance's eldest son, had returned from medical school in Philadelphia in 1874 with a degree and a disturbing fascination with human anatomy that went far beyond professional interest. Margaret, their daughter, possessed an uncanny ability to identify and approach the most vulnerable individuals in any community. She would spend hours in train stations, docks, and boarding houses, seeking out those who appeared lost, alone, or desperate. The family's charitable work seemed beyond reproach. Local newspapers regularly featured stories about their generosity, and visiting dignitaries often made stops at the Woodhaven estate to witness their humanitarian efforts firsthand. The Connecticut State Assembly even passed a resolution in 1878 commending the family for their outstanding service to the community. But beneath this veneer of respectability, something far more sinister was taking root. The Woodhaven Sanctuary operated under a simple but terrifying principle: those who had nowhere else to go, no family to miss them, and no means to support themselves, were the perfect raw material for a business that dealt in human lives. The family had discovered that desperate people could be made to disappear without anyone asking questions, and that there were buyers willing to pay substantial sums for what they provided. The operation began small, with Ezra identifying individuals who met their specific criteria. The perfect victim was someone traveling alone, carrying few possessions, and having no fixed destination or family connections. Margaret would approach these individuals with offers of temporary work and shelter, while Constance would conduct interviews to determine their suitability. Those who passed the family's Macabre screening process would be invited to stay at the estate, where they would be fed, housed, and gradually integrated into the family's daily routines. Dr. Samuel's medical knowledge proved invaluable in determining the physical condition and potential value of each individual. He would conduct what he called medical examinations, carefully documenting each person's health status, physical characteristics, and any unique features that might affect their market value. His detailed records, discovered decades later, read like livestock inventories, reducing human beings to mere commodities with specific prices and characteristics. The Woodhaven estate was perfectly situated for their dark enterprise. The main house sat at the end of a long, winding drive that was invisible from the main road. The property was surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides, with the 4th side bordered by a steep ravine that dropped down to an abandoned quarry. The nearest neighbor lived more than a mile away, and the family had cultivated a reputation for privacy that kept casual visitors at bay. By 1875, the Woodhaven sanctuary was processing an average of 3 individuals per month. The family had established connections with corrupt officials in the county clerk's office who would create false death certificates for a fee. They had developed relationships with buyers in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia who had specific requirements for the human merchandise they sought. And they had perfected a system of disposal that left no trace of their victims' final moments. The warning signs were there for anyone willing to see them. People who entered the Woodhaven estate as guests of the sanctuary had a disturbing tendency to disappear without explanation. Local residents began to notice that certain individuals who had been seen in town would suddenly vanish, often after being approached by Margaret Woodhaven or one of her associates. But in an era when people frequently moved from place to place in search of work, and when communication between distant locations was limited, these disappearances were easily explained away. The family's careful cultivation of their public image made any suspicion seem unthinkable. How could people who had devoted their lives to helping the less fortunate be capable of such monstrous acts? The cognitive dissonance was too great for most people to process, and so the disappearances continued, hidden behind a facade of Christian charity and community service. As the 1870s drew to a close, the Woodhaven family had perfected their system to such a degree that they were operating with complete impunity. They had created a network of accomplices that included not only corrupt officials but also legitimate business owners who benefited from their activities. The family's wealth continued to grow, and their reputation as pillars of the community remained unquestioned. But every system, no matter how carefully constructed, contains the seeds of its own destruction. The Woodhaven family's hubris would eventually lead to their downfall, though not before they had claimed dozens more victims and left a trail of horror that stretched across multiple states. The mass grave discovered in 1891 represented only a fraction of their crimes, and the full scope of their activities would take years to uncover. The story of the Woodhaven family serves as a chilling reminder that evil often hides behind the most respectable facades, and that society's most vulnerable members are frequently preyed upon by those who appear to be their greatest protectors. The Woodhaven family's transformation from respected newcomers to calculating predators did not happen overnight. When Ezra first arrived in Millbrook in 1869, he genuinely appeared to be a man driven by religious conviction and charitable purpose. His early sermons at the Congregational Church focused on themes of redemption and second chances, drawing particularly large crowds when he spoke about society's obligation to care for the dispossessed and forgotten. Ezra's background, as he presented it to the community, was that of a man who had inherited substantial wealth but felt called to use his resources for humanitarian purposes. He claimed his father had built a successful shipping business in Boston before dying in a warehouse accident, leaving Ezra as the sole heir to a considerable fortune. The story was plausible enough, and Ezra's obvious education and refined manners supported his claims of upper-class origins. Constance Woodhaven proved to be the perfect complement to her husband's public persona. Where Ezra was passionate and inspiring, Constance was practical and organized. She quickly established herself as the most efficient organizer of charitable activities the town had ever seen. Her ability to coordinate complex relief efforts and manage multiple programs simultaneously earned her the admiration of Millbrook's established families, who began to defer to her judgment on matters of social welfare. The couple's children, Samuel and Margaret, were raised from an early age to understand that their family was different from others. They were taught that ordinary moral constraints did not apply to people of their superior intelligence and social position. Ezra frequently reminded them that they were destined for greatness, and that achieving their potential might require them to make difficult decisions that lesser people would never understand. Dr. Samuel Woodhaven's medical education at the University of Pennsylvania had exposed him to anatomical studies that went far beyond the standard curriculum. His professors noted his exceptional interest in dissection and his particular fascination with the variations in human physiology. By the time he returned to Millbrook in 1874, Samuel had developed a clinical detachment from human suffering that would prove essential to the family's future enterprises. Margaret Woodhaven possessed what her parents recognized as an extraordinary talent for reading people's vulnerabilities. Even as a teenager, she could identify within minutes of meeting someone exactly what they needed to hear to trust her completely. Her ability to project compassion and understanding while simultaneously assessing a person's potential value made her an invaluable asset to the family's operations. The Millbrook community embraced the Woodhaven family with an enthusiasm that bordered on reverence. In a small town where most families had lived for generations, the arrival of wealthy newcomers who seemed genuinely committed to improving local conditions was cause for celebration. Town leaders competed for the honor of being associated with the family's charitable works, and invitations to social gatherings at the Woodhaven estate were considered marks of distinction. This community support provided the perfect cover for the family's gradual transition from legitimate charity work to something far darker. The Woodhaven Sanctuary for Displaced Souls began as a genuine effort to provide temporary assistance to people in need. The family's early guests were indeed helped to find employment or reconnect with family members in other locations. But Ezra and Constance quickly realized that their position as charitable benefactors gave them unprecedented access to society's most vulnerable individuals. The transformation began with what Ezra called practical considerations. Some of the people who sought help at the sanctuary were clearly beyond assistance through conventional means. They were individuals whose mental or physical conditions made them unemployable, whose criminal backgrounds made them unwelcome in respectable society, or whose complete lack of family connections meant that no one would miss them if they disappeared. Ezra began to rationalize that such people were burdens on society who consumed resources without contributing anything of value. He convinced himself and his family that finding alternative uses for these individuals was not only morally acceptable but actually beneficial to the greater good. The family's first victim was a mentally disabled man named Thomas Fletcher who had been living at the sanctuary for several months without showing any improvement in his condition. If this story is sending chills down your spine, you're not alone. Thousands of people around the world are discovering these hidden chapters of American history through our channel. Hit that like button if you're brave enough to continue this journey with us, and don't forget to share this investigation with friends who appreciate dark historical mysteries. Your support helps us uncover more of these buried truths. The disposal of Thomas Fletcher established the template that the family would follow for years to come. Dr. Samuel's medical knowledge allowed him to determine the most efficient methods of ending a life while preserving whatever value the body might have for their growing network of buyers. Constance's meticulous record-keeping ensured that every detail of the process was documented for future reference. Margaret's skills in manipulation guaranteed that victims would cooperate until it was too late for them to escape. The family discovered that there were markets for human remains that they had never imagined. Medical schools needed cadavers for anatomical study but often struggled to obtain them through legal channels. Private collectors paid substantial sums for unusual specimens or body parts. And there were darker markets still, serving clients whose needs the family chose not to investigate too closely. By 1876, the Woodhaven Sanctuary was processing victims on a regular basis, with the family having perfected their methods of selection, procurement, and disposal. They had established a reputation for discretion that attracted buyers from across the eastern United States, and their profits had grown to the point where their charitable activities were being funded entirely by their criminal enterprise. The community of Millbrook remained completely unaware of what was happening at the estate just outside their town. The Woodhaven family's public face remained as respectable as ever, and their genuine charitable works continued to benefit many people who never suspected the true source of the family's generosity. The perfect crime had been achieved, a systematic murder operation hidden behind a facade of Christian virtue and community service. The success of the Thomas Fletcher operation gave the Woodhaven family a dangerous confidence that would fuel their activities for the next decade. By early 1877, they had established what Ezra privately called their procurement protocols, a systematic approach to identifying, acquiring, and processing human targets that combined Margaret's recruitment skills with Samuel's medical expertise and Constance's operational management. Margaret's hunting grounds expanded beyond Millbrook to include the bustling train stations of Hartford and New Haven, where desperate travelers often found themselves stranded without resources. She developed several personas for different types of potential victims. For families with children, she presented herself as a representative of a charitable organization that could provide temporary housing and employment opportunities. For single men, she posed as the daughter of a wealthy farmer who needed seasonal workers. For women traveling alone, she became a concerned Christian lady offering safe shelter in an increasingly dangerous world. The key to Margaret's success was her ability to identify what she called the invisibles, people whose absence would not be immediately noticed or investigated. Immigrants who spoke limited English and had no established connections in America were particularly vulnerable to her approaches. Orphan children who had aged out of institutional care and were struggling to survive on their own represented another favored category. Traveling salesmen or laborers who moved frequently between jobs provided a steady supply of potential victims. Dr. Samuel's role in the operation had evolved far beyond simple disposal of bodies. He had begun conducting what he termed medical evaluations of potential victims, determining their suitability for different markets based on their physical characteristics, health status, and any unique anatomical features that might increase their value. His detailed records, written in a clinical code that the family had developed, catalogued each individual like livestock being prepared for market. The family had discovered that different buyers had specific preferences and requirements. Medical schools preferred healthy adult specimens with no obvious deformities or signs of disease. Private collectors often sought unusual cases, individuals with rare physical conditions or abnormalities that made them valuable for display or study. The darkest segment of their market consisted of clients whose purposes remained deliberately obscure, but who paid premium prices for victims who met very specific criteria. Constance had transformed the estate's operations to accommodate their growing business. The main house continued to serve as a respectable front, with guest rooms that housed legitimate visitors and charitable cases who would eventually be helped to find employment elsewhere. But the estate's outbuildings had been converted into what she called processing facilities, equipped with the tools and supplies necessary for Samuel's work. The family's disposal methods had become increasingly sophisticated. They had established relationships with corrupt officials in multiple counties who would create false documentation for a fee. Death certificates listing natural causes, transfer documents showing that individuals had moved to other states, and employment records indicating that people had found work in distant locations all helped to explain why certain individuals had disappeared from public view. The abandoned quarry at the edge of the property proved ideal for disposing of remains that could not be sold. The family had discovered that the quarry's limestone walls and deep water would accelerate decomposition while making recovery of evidence nearly impossible. Samuel had calculated that bodies weighted properly would sink to depths that would prevent accidental discovery, even during the driest seasons when water levels dropped significantly. By 1878, the Woodhaven operation was claiming an average of 4 victims per month, with peak periods during the summer months when travel was most common and potential targets were most numerous. The family's wealth had grown substantially, allowing them to expand their legitimate charitable activities and further cement their reputation in the community. They donated generously to local church construction projects, funded scholarships for deserving students, and supported various civic improvements that benefited the entire town. The psychological toll of their activities seemed to affect each family member differently. Ezra had convinced himself that he was performing a service to society by removing unproductive individuals who would otherwise be burdens on the community. His sermons began to include more frequent references to divine judgment and the necessity of making difficult choices for the greater good. Constance approached the operation with the same meticulous attention to detail that she brought to her legitimate charitable work, viewing efficiency and organization as moral imperatives that justified any means necessary to achieve them. Samuel's medical training had provided him with a clinical detachment that allowed him to view their victims as subjects for study rather than human beings deserving of compassion. His journals from this period reveal a man who had completely separated his professional interests from any consideration of the moral implications of his actions. Margaret seemed to thrive on the challenge of manipulating people into trusting her completely, developing an almost artistic appreciation for the techniques that proved most effective with different types of victims. The family's success had also attracted the attention of criminal elements who recognized the potential for collaboration. By late 1878, they had established connections with organized crime groups in Boston and New York who could provide information about potential targets and assistance with disposal of evidence in exchange for a percentage of the profits. These relationships expanded their operational reach while providing additional layers of protection against discovery. The Woodhaven estate had become a destination for wealthy individuals who shared the family's lack of moral restraint. Private gatherings were held regularly, featuring demonstrations of Samuel's techniques and auctions of particularly valuable specimens. These events generated substantial revenue while creating a network of accomplices who had strong incentives to maintain the operation's secrecy. Local law enforcement remained completely unaware of the activities at the estate. The family's reputation for respectability, combined with their generous donations to various civic causes, had made them virtually immune to suspicion. Sheriff William Hartley, whose re-election campaigns had been substantially funded by Woodhaven contributions, considered the family to be among the community's most valuable assets and would not have entertained any suggestion that they might be involved in criminal activities. The system had reached a level of sophistication and efficiency that seemed to guarantee its continuation indefinitely. The family had addressed every potential vulnerability, established multiple layers of protection against discovery, and created a network of accomplices whose self-interest aligned with maintaining the operation's secrecy. Their transformation from charitable benefactors to systematic murderers was complete, and their confidence in their ability to continue their activities without consequences had never been higher. The year 1879 marked a turning point in the Woodhaven family's criminal evolution as they refined their selection criteria and expanded their operational methodology to unprecedented levels of systematic efficiency. Dr. Samuel had developed what he termed the classification system, a detailed framework for categorizing potential victims based on their projected market value and the specific requirements of their growing client base. The classification system divided potential targets into 5 distinct categories. Category 1 consisted of healthy adults between the ages of 20 and 40 with no visible deformities or signs of disease, representing the highest value specimens for medical schools and research institutions. Category 2 included children and adolescents, particularly those with unusual physical characteristics or rare medical conditions that made them valuable to private collectors and specialized buyers. Category 3 encompassed elderly individuals whose primary value lay in their accumulated possessions or any valuable skills they might possess before disposal. Category 4 represented what Samuel clinically referred to as specialty items, individuals with specific physical attributes that commanded premium prices from particular segments of their market. These might include people of unusual height or build, those with distinctive coloring or features, or individuals with physical abnormalities that made them curiosities worthy of preservation. Category 5 consisted of what the family considered disposal cases, people whose primary value was simply in their elimination rather than any commercial potential their remains might possess. Margaret's recruitment techniques had become increasingly sophisticated as she learned to identify category assignments within minutes of initial contact. She had developed what she called the vulnerability assessment, a series of seemingly casual questions and observations that allowed her to determine not only a person's suitability as a victim but also their specific classification and projected value. Her success rate in acquiring targets had improved dramatically, with fewer than 1 in 10 potential victims managing to escape her initial approach. The family's operational base had expanded beyond the main estate to include several auxiliary facilities throughout Connecticut and western Massachusetts. Constance had negotiated the rental of abandoned farm buildings, unused warehouse spaces, and even a defunct textile mill that provided additional processing capabilities during periods of high volume. These satellite locations allowed the family to handle multiple acquisitions simultaneously while reducing the risk of discovery at their primary residence. The transportation network that Constance had established was perhaps the most impressive aspect of their expanded operations. She had cultivated relationships with wagon drivers, railway employees, and shipping clerks who could move human cargo discreetly and efficiently. Payment for these services came not only in cash but also in the form of valuable merchandise recovered from victims, creating a complex economy of corruption that bound dozens of accomplices to the family's success. Dr. Samuel's medical expertise had attracted the attention of several prominent physicians who were conducting research that required access to fresh human specimens. Dr. Harrison Blackwood of Harvard Medical School had become a regular client, paying substantial sums for Category 1 specimens that met his specific anatomical requirements. Professor Charles Whitmore of Yale University's medical program had established a standing order for unusual cases that could be used in his lectures on human abnormalities and pathological conditions. The family's client base had expanded to include buyers whose purposes remained deliberately obscure. A wealthy businessman from New York who identified himself only as Mr. Ashford had become one of their most reliable customers, requesting category for specimens on a monthly basis and paying prices that far exceeded those offered by legitimate medical institutions. The nature of his requirements and the ultimate fate of the individuals he purchased were questions that the family had learned not to ask. Ezra's role in the operation had evolved from hand-son management to what he considered strategic oversight and spiritual guidance. He had convinced himself that their work represented a form of divine selection, removing inferior specimens from the human population while providing valuable services to institutions of higher learning and medical advancement. His Sunday sermons began to incorporate themes of natural selection and the moral obligation of superior individuals to guide the evolutionary process. The family's wealth had reached levels that required careful management to avoid attracting unwanted attention. Constance had established relationships with banks in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia where substantial deposits could be made without triggering inquiries about the source of their funds. She had also begun investing in legitimate business enterprises, including textile mills, shipping companies, and real estate ventures that provided additional layers of financial respectability. The psychological dynamics within the family had shifted as their success continued. Samuel had begun to view himself as a pioneer in medical research, conducting experiments on living subjects that provided insights impossible to obtain through conventional means. His detailed documentation of these procedures, hidden within his official medical records, represented what he considered groundbreaking contributions to scientific knowledge. Margaret had developed an almost artistic appreciation for the manipulation and control of human behavior. She had begun keeping detailed journals documenting her techniques and their effectiveness with different types of victims. Her writing revealed a woman who had found her true calling in the systematic exploitation of human vulnerability and desperation. The community of Millbrook had grown increasingly dependent on the family's continued prosperity. Local businesses benefited from their substantial purchases and generous spending. The town's charitable organizations relied on their donations and organizational expertise. Even the local government had come to depend on their contributions to fund various civic improvements and public works projects. Sheriff Hartley had become so closely associated with the family that his political future was essentially tied to their continued success and respectability. He had begun to view any criticism or suspicion directed toward the Woodhavens as personal attacks on his own judgment and competence. This psychological investment in their innocence made him actively resistant to any information that might suggest criminal activity at the estate. The family's network of corrupt officials had expanded to include clerks in vital records offices, cemetery workers who could provide unmarked burial sites, and even some clergy who were willing to perform bogus funeral services for appropriate compensation. This web of complicity had reached the point where exposing the Woodhaven operation would implicate dozens of respected members of society across multiple states. By the end of 1879, the family was processing an average of 6 victims per month while maintaining their reputation as Connecticut's most generous and respected charitable benefactors. Their system had achieved a level of efficiency and security that seemed to guarantee its indefinite continuation. The transformation from legitimate charity workers to systematic murderers and body merchants was complete, and their confidence in their ability to operate with complete impunity had never been stronger. The early 1880s represented the peak of the Woodhaven family's criminal enterprise, as their operation expanded beyond regional boundaries to establish a network that stretched from Maine to Virginia. What had begun as opportunistic crimes against isolated individuals had evolved into a sophisticated business empire that generated profits exceeding those of legitimate enterprises while maintaining the facade of charitable respectability that protected them from investigation. Dr. Samuel had established formal partnerships with medical institutions throughout the Northeast, creating what he termed the educational supply network. Harvard Medical School, Yale University, the University of Pennsylvania, and Columbia College all maintained standing orders for anatomical specimens that met specific criteria. Samuel's reputation for providing fresh, high-quality materials had made him the preferred supplier for several prominent physicians who were conducting groundbreaking research in human anatomy and pathology. The family's expansion into what Constance called territorial franchising had proven extraordinarily profitable. They had identified corrupt officials and criminal associates in Boston, Providence, Hartford, New York, and Philadelphia who could replicate their methods using local resources and connections. These satellite operations paid substantial percentages of their profits to the Woodhaven family in exchange for access to their techniques, client networks, and disposal methods. Margaret's recruitment capabilities had reached levels that bordered on the supernatural in their effectiveness. She had developed psychological profiles for different categories of potential victims and could adapt her approach within seconds of initial contact to exploit whatever vulnerabilities she detected. Her success rate had improved to the point where fewer than 1 in 20 people she targeted managed to avoid recruitment into the family's operation. The family's client base had expanded to include buyers whose requirements went far beyond conventional medical or research purposes. A secret society operating out of Providence had established monthly orders for individuals who met extremely specific physical and psychological criteria. A wealthy collector in Philadelphia maintained a private museum of human specimens that attracted visitors from across the country who paid substantial fees to view his collection. If this investigation into America's darkest secrets is keeping you on the edge of your seat, you're part of a growing community of truth seekers who refuse to let these stories remain buried. Share this video with someone who appreciates real historical mysteries, hit that like button to support our research, and make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on so you never miss these shocking revelations. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from as we build this global network of people brave enough to confront the truth. The Woodhaven estate had been transformed into what resembled a small industrial complex, with specialized buildings for different aspects of their operation. The main house continued to serve as a respectable front for their charitable activities, but the property now included processing facilities, storage buildings, and even a small railway siding that allowed for discreet transportation of cargo without attracting attention from the main line. Constance had developed supply chain management systems that would have impressed legitimate business owners. She maintained detailed inventories of available specimens, tracked delivery schedules to ensure timely fulfillment of orders, and had established quality control procedures that guaranteed customer satisfaction. Her meticulous record-keeping had created a database of information about their victims that included not only basic physical descriptions but also detailed psychological profiles and assessments of their potential value in different markets. The family's wealth had reached levels that required increasingly sophisticated financial management to avoid detection. They had established holding companies in multiple states, invested in legitimate businesses that provided cover for their criminal activities, and even begun extending loans to other criminal enterprises in exchange for services and protection. Their legitimate charitable foundation had become one of the largest in New England, distributing substantial sums to worthy causes while serving as a vehicle for laundering the profits from their illegal activities. Ezra's position as a moral authority in the community had reached heights that provided almost complete immunity from suspicion. He had been invited to deliver sermons at churches throughout Connecticut and Massachusetts, his writings on Christian charity had been published in religious journals, and he had been appointed to several state committees dealing with social welfare issues. His public reputation for righteousness had become so well established that any suggestion of criminal involvement would have been dismissed as impossible by those who knew him. The psychological transformation of the family members had accelerated as their success continued. Samuel had begun to view himself as a pioneer in medical science, conducting experiments on living subjects that provided insights impossible to obtain through conventional research methods. His detailed documentation of these procedures, disguised within legitimate medical records, represented what he considered revolutionary contributions to scientific knowledge that would eventually be recognized and celebrated. Margaret had developed an almost artistic appreciation for the manipulation and control of human behavior. She had begun training apprentices in her techniques, young women who could expand the family's recruitment capabilities while learning the skills necessary to identify and acquire targets. Her journals from this period reveal a woman who had found profound satisfaction in the systematic exploitation of human vulnerability and desperation. The community's dependence on the Woodhaven family had grown to the point where their continued prosperity was essential to the economic stability of the entire region. Local businesses relied on their substantial purchases and generous spending patterns. The town's charitable organizations depended on their donations and organizational expertise. Even the regional government had come to view their contributions as necessary components of the budget for various public works and social programs. Sheriff Hartley had become so closely identified with the family that any threat to their reputation represented a direct challenge to his own political survival. He had begun to actively discourage any investigations or inquiries that might cast doubt on their activities, using his authority to redirect attention away from the estate and toward other potential sources of criminal activity in the region. The family's network of accomplices had expanded to include hundreds of individuals whose livelihoods depended on the continued success of the operation. Wagon drivers, railway employees, shipping clerks, cemetery workers, corrupt officials, and even some clergy had become integral components of a system that generated substantial income for all participants while maintaining the secrecy necessary for continued operations. By 1882, the Woodhaven family was processing an average of 10 victims per month while their legitimate charitable activities continued to earn praise and recognition from religious and civic leaders throughout New England. Their transformation from respected community benefactors to the operators of one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in American history was complete, and their confidence in their ability to continue indefinitely had reached levels that bordered on arrogance. The success of their operation had created a sense of invincibility that would prove to be their greatest vulnerability. The family had become so convinced of their own cleverness and the perfection of their system that they had begun to take risks that a more cautious approach would have avoided. The seeds of their eventual downfall were being planted by their own hubris, though it would take several more years before those seeds would begin to sprout. The spring of 1883 brought the first serious threats to the Woodhaven family's seemingly impenetrable operation, as a series of close calls and near discoveries forced them to implement increasingly desperate security measures that would ultimately accelerate their path toward exposure. The very success that had made them wealthy and powerful had also created vulnerabilities that their growing arrogance had prevented them from recognizing until crisis forced their attention. The first warning came from an unexpected source when Dr. Harrison Blackwood of Harvard Medical School contacted Samuel with disturbing news. A colleague had begun asking questions about the unusually consistent quality and freshness of specimens that Samuel had been providing, noting that the bodies showed none of the typical signs of natural death or extended storage that characterized materials obtained through conventional channels. Blackwood warned that academic curiosity about Samuel's supply methods was growing and recommended a temporary suspension of deliveries until suspicion subsided. Margaret encountered her own close call during a recruitment operation at the Hartford railway station when she approached a young woman who initially appeared to meet their criteria for acquisition. The woman, who introduced herself as Sarah Pemberton, seemed to be traveling alone with limited resources and no clear destination. However, during their conversation, Margaret discovered that Sarah was actually the daughter of a prominent Boston attorney who was traveling incognito to investigate reports of missing persons in the Connecticut Valley region. The realization that she had nearly attempted to recruit the daughter of a man with both the resources and motivation to pursue a thorough investigation sent Margaret into a state of panic that required several days to resolve. The incident forced the family to recognize that their victim selection criteria needed significant refinement to account for the possibility that potential targets might not be what they initially appeared to be. Constance discovered that their financial activities had attracted the attention of banking officials who were beginning to ask questions about the source of their substantial and regular deposits. A clerk at the Hartford National Bank had noted that the family's deposit pattern seemed inconsistent with the seasonal nature of most agricultural and charitable enterprises, leading to informal inquiries about the specific sources of their income. The bank's growing interest in their financial affairs represented a potential threat that required immediate attention and careful management. The family's satellite operations had also begun to generate security concerns as some of their franchise partners proved less capable of maintaining the discretion and security standards that the Woodhaven operation required. A corrupt official in Providence had been arrested on unrelated charges, creating the possibility that he might attempt to negotiate reduced punishment by providing information about his criminal associates. A wagon driver in Boston had begun drinking heavily and making veiled references to unusual cargo that he transported for wealthy clients. Dr. Samuel's experiments had become increasingly bold and elaborate, driven by his conviction that he was conducting groundbreaking medical research that would eventually earn him recognition as a pioneer in anatomical science. However, his expanded activities had required the construction of additional facilities and the acquisition of specialized equipment that attracted attention from suppliers and delivery personnel who began to speculate about the true nature of his work. The family's response to these emerging threats involved the systematic elimination of potential witnesses and the implementation of security measures that represented a significant escalation in their willingness to use violence to protect their operation. The corrupt official in Providence died in his cell under circumstances that were officially attributed to suicide but privately recognized by informed observers as assassination. The drinking wagon driver in Boston disappeared entirely, with his body eventually recovered from the harbor under circumstances that suggested deliberate drowning. Ezra's public persona had become so elevated that he was increasingly viewed as a candidate for higher political office, with several prominent citizens suggesting that he should consider running for the state legislature or even seeking appointment to important government positions. However, this growing public attention represented both an opportunity for increased protection and a significant risk of enhanced scrutiny that could expose aspects of their operation that had previously remained hidden. The family had established what Constance termed the Emergency Response Protocol, a systematic plan for dealing with threats to their security that involved multiple layers of defensive measures ranging from bribery and intimidation to elimination of witnesses and destruction of evidence. The protocol included detailed procedures for rapidly dismantling their operation and destroying incriminating materials if exposure became imminent. Margaret had begun training a network of female accomplices who could expand their recruitment capabilities while providing additional layers of protection against discovery. These women, recruited from among the desperate individuals who sought help at the sanctuary, were gradually introduced to the family's methods and given increasing responsibility for identifying and approaching potential victims. The expansion of their recruitment network allowed for greater operational capacity while creating additional barriers between the family and their criminal activities. The family's client base had become so extensive that managing the complex web of relationships and obligations had become a full-time occupation for Constance. She had developed elaborate systems for tracking orders, managing deliveries, and maintaining the security protocols necessary to protect both their clients and their operation. The administrative complexity of their enterprise had reached levels that rivaled those of legitimate businesses while creating additional opportunities for security breaches and exposure. Sheriff Hartley had become so invested in protecting the family's reputation that he had begun to actively suppress any investigations or inquiries that might threaten their standing in the community. His willingness to use his official authority to shield them from scrutiny had provided essential protection, but it had also created a dependency that could become a liability if his own position became threatened by political changes or corruption investigations. The psychological pressure of maintaining their double life had begun to affect each family member differently. Samuel had become increasingly obsessed with his medical experiments, spending most of his time in his laboratory facilities and showing signs of mental instability that concerned even his family members. Margaret had developed a paranoid awareness of potential threats that made her suspicious of every interaction and conversation. Constance had become so focused on operational security that she had begun to view even longtime associates as potential security risks. The family's network of accomplices had grown so large that maintaining effective control and security had become increasingly difficult. The more people who knew about their activities, the greater the risk that someone would eventually make a mistake or decide that cooperation was no longer in their best interest. The very success that had made their operation profitable was also making it vulnerable to exposure through the actions of individuals over whom they had incomplete control. By the end of 1883, the Woodhaven family had implemented security measures that represented a significant escalation in their willingness to use violence and intimidation to protect their operation. However, these same measures had created new risks and vulnerabilities that would ultimately contribute to their downfall. The family's growing paranoia and increasingly desperate actions were beginning to attract the very attention they were trying to avoid, setting the stage for the investigations and discoveries that would eventually expose their crimes. The winter of 1884 marked the beginning of the end for the Woodhaven family's criminal empire as growing suspicions within the community began to crystallize into actual investigations, despite their increasingly desperate efforts to maintain the facade of respectability that had protected them for over a decade. The very security measures they had implemented to protect their operation had begun to generate the attention and scrutiny they had sought to avoid. The first serious challenge to their operation came from an unexpected source when Father Michael O'Brien, the newly appointed priest at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Hartford, began conducting his own informal investigation into the disappearances that had been occurring throughout the Connecticut Valley region. Unlike his predecessor, who had been content to accept official explanations for missing persons cases, Father O'Brien possessed both the education and the determination necessary to recognize patterns that others had overlooked or chosen to ignore. Father O'Brien's investigation had been prompted by the desperate pleas of several parishioners whose family members had vanished after seeking help from various charitable organizations in the region. Maria Santos, whose teenage son had disappeared after being offered employment at a farm outside Millbrook, had provided the priest with detailed information about the woman who had recruited her son. Her description of Margaret Woodhaven's appearance and methods had triggered memories of similar stories that Father O'Brien had heard from other grieving families. The priest's methodical approach to documenting these cases had revealed disturbing patterns in the disappearances that suggested systematic rather than random criminal activity. The missing individuals all shared certain characteristics: they were traveling alone, had limited financial resources, possessed no strong family connections that would prompt extensive searches, and had been approached by representatives of charitable organizations offering assistance with housing or employment. Dr. Samuel's increasingly erratic behavior had begun to attract attention from medical colleagues who were concerned about his mental stability and professional competence. His obsession with anatomical research had led him to make statements during professional gatherings that suggested knowledge and experiences that went far beyond conventional medical practice. Several physicians had begun to question how Samuel had obtained the extensive hands-on experience with living human anatomy that his comments seemed to indicate. Margaret's recruitment activities had become more aggressive and less discriminating as the family security concerns had increased their urgency to maintain operational volume despite growing risks. Her desperation to meet quotas had led her to approach individuals who did not fully meet their established criteria for safe targets, resulting in several near disasters that had required emergency intervention to prevent exposure. The family's financial activities had attracted more serious attention from banking officials who had begun to coordinate their inquiries across multiple institutions. The Hartford National Bank had shared its concerns about the Woodhaven accounts with colleagues at banks in Boston and New York, leading to a broader investigation of their deposit patterns and financial relationships. The discovery that the family maintained accounts at multiple banks with deposit patterns that seemed inconsistent with legitimate charitable activities had prompted formal inquiries that could no longer be dismissed or deflected. Constance had implemented what she called the Scorched Earth Protocol, a systematic plan for destroying evidence and eliminating witnesses that represented the family's most desperate attempt to protect their operation from exposure. The protocol included procedures for the rapid disposal of incriminating materials, the elimination of accomplices who posed security risks, and the creation of false documentation that could provide alternative explanations for their activities if investigations became unavoidable. The community of Millbrook had begun to experience what residents described as an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that seemed to center around the Woodhaven estate. Several longtime residents had noticed that people who visited the estate as guests of the sanctuary seemed to disappear with unusual frequency, and that the family's explanations for these departures often seemed inconsistent or implausible when examined closely. If these revelations about America's buried secrets are shocking you as much as they're shocking our global community of truth seekers, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss these investigations. Share this video with friends who can handle the darkest chapters of our history, and let us know in the comments what time zone you're watching from as we uncover these hidden truths together. Your support helps us continue exposing the stories that powerful people tried to bury forever. Sheriff Hartley's attempts to suppress investigations and redirect attention away from the Woodhaven family had become so obvious that they were beginning to attract criticism from citizens who questioned whether his close relationship with the family was affecting his judgment and compromising his ability to perform his duties effectively. Several prominent residents had begun to call for outside assistance in investigating the disappearances that had been occurring in the region. The family's network of accomplices had begun to show signs of instability as the increasing risks and security measures had created an atmosphere of fear and paranoia that affected everyone involved in their operation. Several key participants had expressed concerns about continuing their involvement, while others had begun to demand additional compensation in exchange for maintaining their silence and cooperation. Dr. Samuel's laboratory facilities had been discovered by a maintenance worker who had been hired to repair storm damage to one of the estate's outbuildings. The worker's description of the equipment and materials he had observed had prompted questions from other employees and contractors who had begun to speculate about the true nature of the research being conducted on the property. Margaret's network of female accomplices had proven to be a significant security liability as several of these women had begun to experience psychological problems related to their involvement in recruitment activities. One woman had suffered what appeared to be a complete mental breakdown and had begun making statements about her experiences that, while incoherent, contained enough factual details to be potentially damaging if properly interpreted. The family's client relationships had become increasingly strained as their security concerns had led them to implement new procedures and restrictions that interfered with the efficient delivery of services that their buyers expected. Several major clients had expressed dissatisfaction with recent changes in the operation and had begun to seek alternative suppliers for their requirements. Ezra's public position had become both a protection and a vulnerability, as his prominence made it difficult for critics to challenge him directly, while also making any scandal associated with his name potentially devastating to his reputation and political prospects. His growing paranoia about potential threats had led him to make statements and take actions that seemed inconsistent with his public persona, prompting questions about his judgment and mental stability. The psychological pressure of maintaining their operation under increasingly difficult circumstances had begun to affect the family's ability to make rational decisions and coordinate their activities effectively. The stress of constant vigilance and the fear of exposure had created an atmosphere of mutual suspicion and blame that threatened to destroy their unity and compromise their ability to respond effectively to emerging threats. By early 1885, the Woodhaven family's criminal enterprise was under assault from multiple directions, with investigations and suspicions mounting despite their increasingly desperate efforts to maintain control. The very success that had made them wealthy and powerful had also created the visibility and complexity that was making their operation impossible to sustain. The end was approaching, though none of them yet realized how close it had become. The spring of 1885 brought the emergence of a key witness whose testimony would prove instrumental in exposing the Woodhaven family's crimes, as Father O'Brien's patient investigation finally produced the breakthrough that law enforcement officials had been unable to achieve through conventional methods. The priest's discovery of a survivor who had escaped from the family's operation provided the first direct evidence of criminal activity that could not be dismissed or explained away through the elaborate cover stories that had protected the family for years. Emma Caldwell had been recruited by Margaret Woodhaven in the summer of 1884 while seeking employment in Hartford after losing her position as a domestic servant. Like dozens of others before her, Emma had been approached by a well-dressed woman who offered temporary housing and assistance in finding permanent work at a respectable farm outside the city. The promise of steady employment and safe accommodation had seemed like an answer to her desperate prayers. Emma's experience at the Woodhaven estate had begun normally enough, with comfortable quarters in the main house and participation in what appeared to be legitimate charitable activities. However, after several weeks of residence, she had begun to notice disturbing patterns in the treatment of certain guests who seemed to disappear without explanation. Her attempts to ask questions about the fate of these individuals had been met with evasive answers and increasing restrictions on her movements around the property. The turning point in Emma's captivity had come when she accidentally witnessed Dr. Samuel conducting what he described as a medical examination on a young man who had arrived at the estate the previous week. The procedure, which Emma observed through a partially open door, bore no resemblance to any legitimate medical practice she had ever seen. The victim's screams and Dr. Samuel's clinical detachment during the examination had convinced Emma that she was witnessing something far more sinister than medical research. Emma's escape from the estate had been accomplished during a winter storm in February 1885, when the family's attention was focused on managing a crisis involving one of their satellite operations that had been discovered by local authorities. She had fled through the woods in a blizzard, nearly dying from exposure before being discovered by a farmer who brought her to St. Mary's Church, where Father O'Brien had provided sanctuary and medical care. Father O'Brien's interviews with Emma had revealed details about the Woodhaven operation that confirmed his worst suspicions about the family's activities. Emma's descriptions of the estate's layout, the specialized facilities that Dr. Samuel had constructed, and the systematic processing of victims provided the foundation for a comprehensive understanding of how the criminal enterprise functioned. Her testimony included specific dates, names, and descriptions that could be corroborated through official records and witness statements. The priest's investigation had also uncovered evidence of corruption within local law enforcement that explained why previous inquiries into the disappearances had been unsuccessful. Emma's account of conversations she had overheard between family members and Sheriff Hartley revealed the extent to which official investigations had been compromised by bribery and intimidation. The discovery that law enforcement officials were actively protecting the family's operation had prompted Father O'Brien to seek assistance from authorities outside the local jurisdiction. Dr. Samuel's psychological deterioration had accelerated dramatically following several close calls that had threatened to expose his experimental activities. His obsession with anatomical research had evolved into what his own family members recognized as dangerous mental instability. His increasingly erratic behavior during social gatherings had prompted comments from medical colleagues who were beginning to question his fitness to practice medicine. Margaret's recruitment network had begun to collapse as several of her female accomplices had either fled the operation or suffered mental breakdowns that compromised their ability to maintain the secrecy essential to the family's continued success. The paranoia and fear that had infected the entire organization had made it impossible to maintain the trust and cooperation necessary for effective coordination of their criminal activities. Constance's attempts to implement damage control measures had created additional problems as her increasingly desperate efforts to eliminate potential witnesses and destroy incriminating evidence had attracted attention from observers who had begun to notice the unusual number of accidents and disappearances affecting people connected to the Woodhaven operation. Her systematic approach to witness elimination had become so obvious that it was generating suspicion rather than providing protection. The family's financial situation had become precarious as their legitimate business investments had begun to suffer from their inability to provide adequate attention to operational management. Their focus on security concerns and damage control had diverted resources and attention away from the activities that generated their wealth, creating a downward spiral that threatened their ability to maintain the operation's infrastructure and personnel. Emma's testimony had provided Father O'Brien with specific information about the location of physical evidence that could substantiate her claims about the family's criminal activities. Her detailed descriptions of Dr. Samuel's laboratory facilities, the location of disposal sites on the estate property, and the methods used to destroy evidence had given investigators precise targets for their searches and examinations. The priest had begun coordinating with authorities in Boston and Hartford who possessed both the jurisdiction and the political independence necessary to conduct a thorough investigation of the Woodhaven family without interference from corrupted local officials. His careful documentation of evidence and witness testimony had provided these investigators with a comprehensive foundation for building criminal cases that could survive legal challenges. Ezra's public reputation had begun to suffer as rumors and speculation about his family's activities had started to circulate within religious and civic circles throughout Connecticut. His attempts to maintain his position as a moral authority while dealing with mounting evidence of criminal behavior had created inconsistencies in his public statements and actions that observant critics had begun to notice and question. The family's network of accomplices had reached a state of near-complete collapse as the increasing risks and pressures had made continued participation untenable for most participants. The combination of external investigations and internal paranoia had created an atmosphere of mutual distrust and fear that had destroyed the cooperation and loyalty essential to the operation's continued success. Sheriff Hartley's position had become increasingly precarious as criticism of his handling of missing persons cases had attracted attention from state authorities who were beginning to question his competence and integrity. His obvious efforts to protect the Woodhaven family from investigation had become so blatant that they were generating political pressure for his removal from office and potential criminal prosecution for corruption and obstruction of justice. The psychological pressure on all family members had reached levels that were affecting their ability to function effectively in their various roles within the operation. The constant fear of exposure, combined with the growing evidence that their elaborate security measures were failing to provide protection, had created a state of crisis that threatened to destroy their organization from within even as external pressures mounted from multiple directions. By the summer of 1885, the Woodhaven family's criminal enterprise was facing imminent collapse as investigations closed in from multiple directions while their internal organization disintegrated under the pressure of mounting paranoia and fear. Emma Caldwell's testimony had provided the breakthrough that law enforcement needed to build comprehensive cases against all family members, setting the stage for the dramatic confrontations and revelations that would finally expose the full scope of their crimes. The autumn of 1885 brought the final confrontation between the Woodhaven family and the forces of justice as coordinated investigations by state and federal authorities converged on the estate in Millbrook, triggering a desperate series of cover-up attempts that would ultimately provide investigators with even more damning evidence of the family's systematic crimes. The carefully constructed facade of respectability that had protected them for over 15 years was about to crumble under the weight of overwhelming evidence and testimony. Detective Inspector William Morrison of the Connecticut State Police had been assigned to lead the investigation based on Father O'Brien's comprehensive documentation and Emma Caldwell's detailed testimony. Morrison's reputation for thoroughness and his political independence from local corruption networks had made him the ideal choice to pursue a case that required both investigative skill and the courage to challenge powerful and well-connected suspects. The investigation's first major breakthrough had come when Morrison's team executed a carefully planned surveillance operation that documented the family's activities over a period of several weeks. Hidden observers had recorded the arrival and processing of victims, the transportation of materials to and from the estate, and the systematic destruction of evidence that confirmed Emma's testimony about the operation's methods and procedures. Dr. Samuel's laboratory facilities had been discovered during a covert search of the estate's outbuildings, revealing a collection of equipment, documents, and preserved specimens that provided irrefutable evidence of illegal medical experimentation on living subjects. The detailed records that Samuel had maintained of his procedures, written in the clinical code that the family had developed, included descriptions of techniques and results that constituted clear evidence of torture and murder. Margaret's recruitment activities had been exposed through the testimony of several women who had been trained as accomplices but had fled the operation when the family's security measures had become too extreme for them to continue. These witnesses provided detailed accounts of the methods used to identify and approach potential victims, the psychological techniques employed to gain their trust, and the systematic processing that followed their arrival at the estate. Constance's financial records had been seized during coordinated raids on banks in Hartford, Boston, and New York, revealing the complex network of accounts and investments that the family had used to launder the profits from their criminal activities. The banking documents provided a comprehensive picture of the operation's scope and profitability, while also exposing the corrupt officials and business associates who had facilitated their money laundering activities. The family's response to these developments had been a series of increasingly desperate attempts to destroy evidence and eliminate witnesses that had only served to provide investigators with additional proof of their guilt. Constance had ordered the systematic burning of documents and records, but investigators had been able to recover enough material from the ashes to reconstruct much of the information that had been destroyed. Ezra's attempts to use his political connections and public reputation to influence the investigation had backfired spectacularly when several prominent supporters had withdrawn their backing after learning about the evidence that had been gathered against his family. His efforts to portray the investigation as religious persecution had failed to gain traction as the physical evidence of criminal activity had become too overwhelming to dismiss or explain away. The discovery of mass graves on the estate property had provided the most dramatic confirmation of the charges against the family when excavation teams had uncovered the remains of 47 individuals whose deaths could be directly linked to the Woodhaven operation. The forensic evidence from these graves had revealed details about the methods used to kill victims and dispose of their bodies that corroborated witness testimony and documentary evidence. Sheriff Hartley's arrest on charges of corruption and obstruction of justice had eliminated the family's primary source of protection within local law enforcement, while also providing investigators with additional evidence about the extent of official complicity in the operation. Hartley's desperate attempts to negotiate reduced charges in exchange for testimony against the family had revealed details about their criminal activities that even Emma Caldwell's comprehensive account had not included. The family's network of accomplices had completely collapsed as the mounting evidence had made continued association with the operation too dangerous for anyone to risk. Former associates had begun to approach investigators with offers to provide testimony in exchange for immunity from prosecution, creating a flood of information that had revealed the full scope of the criminal enterprise and its connections to corruption networks throughout the region. Dr. Samuel's mental breakdown had accelerated to the point where he had begun making public statements that amounted to confessions of criminal activity, apparently believing that his medical experiments would eventually be recognized as groundbreaking scientific research that justified any methods necessary to achieve his results. His increasingly erratic behavior had provided investigators with additional evidence while also demonstrating the psychological toll that years of systematic murder had taken on even the most hardened participants. Margaret's capture during an attempt to flee to Canada had provided investigators with the final pieces of evidence needed to build comprehensive cases against all family members. The documents and personal effects found in her possession had included detailed records of recruitment activities, victim profiles, and correspondence with clients that revealed the international scope of the operation and its connections to criminal networks in multiple countries. The public reaction to the revelations about the Woodhaven family had been one of shock and disbelief as community members struggled to reconcile the evidence of systematic criminal activity with their memories of the family's charitable works and public service. The psychological impact of learning that respected community leaders had been operating one of the most sophisticated murder enterprises in American history had created lasting trauma that would affect the region for generations. The investigation had also revealed the extent to which legitimate institutions had unknowingly participated in the family's criminal activities by purchasing specimens and materials without questioning their sources. Medical schools, research institutions, and private collectors throughout the Northeast had been forced to confront the possibility that their anatomical collections included the remains of murder victims who had been processed through the Woodhaven operation. The legal proceedings that followed the family's arrest had attracted national attention as newspapers throughout the country had covered the shocking details of crimes that seemed almost too monstrous to believe. The testimony of witnesses like Emma Caldwell had provided the public with unprecedented insight into the systematic nature of the family's criminal enterprise and the psychological manipulation that had made their operation possible. The evidence gathered during the investigation had revealed that the Woodhaven family's criminal activities had extended far beyond the murders committed at their estate to include a comprehensive network of corruption, money laundering, and organized crime that had infected legitimate institutions throughout the region. The full scope of their crimes would take years to investigate and prosecute, with new evidence continuing to emerge long after their initial arrest and conviction. By the winter of 1885, the Woodhaven family's reign of terror had finally come to an end, but the investigation of their crimes had revealed a level of systematic evil and institutional corruption that would have lasting implications for American society's understanding of how such monstrous activities could be concealed behind facades of respectability and charitable purpose. The winter of 1886 witnessed the final desperate attempts by the Woodhaven family to escape justice as overwhelming evidence mounted against them, while investigators uncovered the smoking gun documentation that would seal their fate and reveal the true scope of their criminal enterprise to a horrified nation. The family's last-ditch efforts to flee or destroy evidence would only serve to provide prosecutors with additional proof of their guilt and consciousness of wrongdoing. The breakthrough that investigators had been seeking came when Constance's own meticulous record-keeping proved to be her downfall. Hidden beneath the floor of her private study, Detective Inspector Morrison's team discovered what Constance had called her master ledger, a comprehensive accounting of every victim processed through their operation since 1873. The ledger contained detailed entries for each individual, including their names, physical descriptions, recruitment circumstances, processing dates, disposal methods, and the prices received from various buyers. The master ledger revealed that the Woodhaven family had systematically murdered 137 people over a 12-year period, generating profits that exceeded $200,000 in contemporary currency. The clinical precision with which Constance had documented each transaction demonstrated a level of premeditation and systematic planning that shocked even experienced investigators who had dealt with numerous murder cases throughout their careers. Dr. Samuel's personal journals, discovered during a search of his laboratory facilities, provided equally damning evidence of the family's crimes while revealing the disturbing psychological evolution that had transformed a trained physician into a systematic killer. His detailed descriptions of experimental procedures conducted on living subjects read like the work of a madman, yet they were written with the clinical precision of a scientist documenting groundbreaking research. Margaret's correspondence with clients and accomplices, found sewn into the lining of a traveling case she had attempted to smuggle out of the country, revealed the international scope of the operation and its connections to criminal networks throughout North America and Europe. Her letters described recruitment techniques with the same professional pride that a legitimate business owner might use to discuss successful marketing strategies. Ezra's final attempt to escape justice had involved a desperate effort to flee to Mexico with a substantial portion of the family's liquid assets. His capture at the border had provided investigators with additional evidence about the family's financial operations and their preparations for the possibility that their crimes might eventually be discovered. The false identity documents and foreign bank account information found in his possession revealed the extent of their planning for potential exposure. The public revelations about the Woodhaven family's crimes had triggered a massive investigation into the corrupt networks that had enabled their operation to continue undetected for over a decade. Federal authorities had begun examining the activities of officials in multiple states who had received payments from the family in exchange for false documentation and protection from investigation. The testimony of former accomplices who had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences had revealed the sophisticated organizational structure that the family had developed to manage their criminal enterprise. These witnesses described an operation that functioned with the efficiency and coordination of a legitimate business, complete with established procedures, quality control measures, and customer service protocols. The forensic examination of remains discovered on the estate property had provided investigators with scientific evidence that corroborated witness testimony about the family's methods and procedures. Medical experts who examined the bodies had identified clear signs of systematic torture and experimentation that supported charges of premeditated murder and crimes against humanity. The financial investigation had revealed that the Woodhaven family's legitimate charitable activities had been funded entirely by profits from their criminal enterprise, creating a perverse situation in which genuine good works had been subsidized by systematic murder. This discovery had profound implications for the numerous individuals and organizations that had benefited from the family's generosity over the years. The psychological evaluation of family members conducted by court-appointed experts had revealed the disturbing dynamics that had enabled for individuals to participate in systematic murder for over a decade without any of them developing sufficient moral qualms to stop or expose the operation. The evaluation suggested that the family's isolation and shared delusions had created a psychological environment that made their crimes seem not only acceptable but morally justified. If you're still with us after these shocking revelations about one of America's most disturbing family crimes, you're truly part of our brave community of truth seekers. This investigation required months of research into sealed records and forgotten archives that most people will never see. Hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who can handle the darkest chapters of our hidden history. Let us know in the comments what country you're watching from as we build this global network of people who refuse to let these stories stay buried. The legal proceedings against the family had attracted unprecedented media attention as newspapers throughout the country had competed to provide the most comprehensive coverage of crimes that seemed almost too monstrous to believe. The detailed testimony presented during the trials had given the American public an unprecedented look into the psychology and methods of systematic murderers. The impact of the Woodhaven case had extended far beyond the immediate prosecutions to influence legislation and law enforcement practices throughout the United States. The systematic nature of the family's crimes and the extensive corruption that had enabled them to operate undetected had prompted reforms in missing persons investigations, banking regulations, and oversight of charitable organizations. The international implications of the case had become apparent as investigators had traced the family's client network to buyers in multiple countries who had purchased human remains and specimens without questioning their sources. The revelations had prompted diplomatic exchanges and international cooperation in investigating similar criminal enterprises that might be operating in other locations. The community of Millbrook had struggled to come to terms with the revelation that their most respected residents had been operating a systematic murder enterprise from their estate just outside the town. The psychological impact of learning that people they had known and trusted for years had been capable of such monstrous crimes had created lasting trauma that would affect the community for generations. The medical and academic institutions that had unknowingly purchased specimens from the Woodhaven operation had been forced to confront the ethical implications of their research and teaching practices. The discovery that their anatomical collections might include the remains of murder victims had prompted comprehensive reviews of procurement procedures and source documentation requirements. The Woodhaven case had also revealed the vulnerability of society's most marginalized populations to systematic exploitation and violence. The family's deliberate targeting of individuals who were unlikely to be missed or thoroughly investigated had highlighted the need for better protection and oversight of charitable organizations that claimed to serve vulnerable populations. The final evidence that allayed the family's fate had come from an unexpected source when construction workers renovating the estate's main house had discovered a hidden room containing preserved specimens, detailed photographic documentation of procedures, and correspondence with buyers that provided irrefutable proof of the operation's scope and systematic nature. This discovery had eliminated any possibility that the family could claim ignorance or argue that their activities had been less extensive than prosecutors alleged. By the spring of 1886, the investigation into the Woodhaven family's crimes had uncovered evidence of systematic murder, torture, corruption, and organized crime that represented one of the most comprehensive criminal enterprises in American history. The smoking gun evidence that prosecutors had discovered would ensure that justice would finally be served for the 137 victims whose lives had been ended by the family's monstrous pursuit of profit and perverse scientific curiosity. The spring and summer of 1886 brought the pursuit of justice for the Woodhaven family's crimes as prosecutors built comprehensive cases that would expose the full extent of their systematic murders while revealing the broader network of corruption and criminal activity that had enabled their operation to continue undetected for over a decade. The legal proceedings would set precedents for prosecuting organized crime and establish new standards for investigating missing persons cases throughout the United States. The prosecution team, led by Connecticut Attorney General Samuel Harrison, had assembled what legal experts considered the most comprehensive criminal case in American history. The evidence against the family included physical specimens, detailed documentation, witness testimony, financial records, and forensic analysis that created an overwhelming foundation for charges of premeditated murder, torture, conspiracy, corruption, and crimes against humanity. The trial of Ezra Woodhaven began in Hartford Superior Court in June 1886, attracting national attention as newspapers from across the country sent reporters to cover proceedings that promised to reveal unprecedented details about systematic murder and institutional corruption. The prosecution's opening statement outlined charges that included the premeditated murder of 137 individuals and the operation of a criminal enterprise that had generated profits exceeding $200,000. Ezra's defense team had attempted to argue that their client was a victim of religious persecution who had been targeted because of his charitable activities and moral authority within the community. However, this strategy had collapsed when prosecutors had presented Constance's master ledger, which documented Ezra's direct involvement in victim selection and his receipt of substantial payments from buyers of human remains and specimens. The testimony of Emma Caldwell had provided jurors with a first-hand account of the systematic nature of the family's operation and the calculating cruelty with which they had treated their victims. Her detailed descriptions of the estate's facilities, the family's methods, and the fate of other individuals who had sought help at the sanctuary had created a compelling narrative that prosecutors had used to illustrate the premeditated nature of the crimes. Dr. Samuel's trial had focused on the medical experimentation that he had conducted on living subjects, with prosecutors presenting his detailed journals as evidence of torture and murder disguised as scientific research. Medical experts who testified for the prosecution had described Samuel's procedures as having no legitimate medical purpose beyond satisfying his sadistic curiosity about human anatomy and pain tolerance. The psychological evaluation of Samuel had revealed a man who had completely divorced himself from normal human empathy and moral constraints, viewing his victims as laboratory specimens rather than human beings deserving of compassion and dignity. His courtroom behavior during the trial had demonstrated the disturbing detachment that had enabled him to participate in systematic murder for over a decade. Margaret's trial had exposed the sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques that she had used to recruit victims and gain their trust before delivering them to the family's processing facilities. Witnesses who had escaped her recruitment efforts had testified about her ability to identify vulnerable individuals and exploit their desperation to convince them to accompany her to the estate. The prosecution had presented evidence that Margaret had personally recruited over 80% of the family's victims, making her directly responsible for the deaths of more than 100 people. Her detailed correspondence with clients had revealed her pride in her recruitment abilities and her complete lack of remorse for the suffering that her actions had caused. Constance's trial had focused on her role as the operational manager of the criminal enterprise, with prosecutors presenting her meticulous records as evidence of premeditation and systematic planning. Her master ledger had provided irrefutable proof of her involvement in every aspect of the operation, from victim processing to financial management to client relations. The financial evidence presented during Constance's trial had revealed the extent to which legitimate institutions throughout the Northeast had unknowingly participated in the family's criminal activities by purchasing specimens and materials without questioning their sources. The revelation that respected medical schools and research institutions had been unwitting customers of a murder enterprise had prompted widespread reforms in procurement procedures and oversight requirements. The trials had also exposed the extensive corruption that had enabled the family's operation to continue undetected, with former Sheriff Hartley and dozens of other officials facing criminal charges for accepting bribes and obstructing investigations. The systematic nature of this corruption had prompted federal investigations into law enforcement practices throughout the region. The broader implications of the Woodhaven case had begun to emerge as investigators had traced connections between the family's operation and similar criminal enterprises in other states. The discovery that systematic murder for profit was more widespread than previously imagined had prompted congressional hearings and federal legislation designed to prevent similar crimes. The international scope of the family's client network had created diplomatic complications as foreign governments had demanded information about their citizens who might have been involved in purchasing human remains from the operation. The case had highlighted the need for international cooperation in investigating and prosecuting crimes that crossed national boundaries. The psychological impact of the revelations about the Woodhaven family had extended far beyond the immediate community to affect public understanding of how systematic evil could be concealed behind facades of respectability and charitable purpose. The case had become a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of society's most marginalized populations to exploitation and violence. The reform movements that had emerged in response to the Woodhaven case had focused on improving protection for vulnerable populations, establishing better oversight of charitable organizations, and creating new standards for missing persons investigations. These reforms had been designed to prevent similar crimes while ensuring that victims of such operations would not be forgotten or ignored. The legal precedents established during the Woodhaven trials had influenced the development of new approaches to prosecuting organized crime and systematic murder. The comprehensive nature of the evidence presented and the coordination required to build cases against all family members had created models that would be used in future prosecutions of complex criminal enterprises. The verdicts in all 4 trials had been unanimous convictions on all charges, with the juries deliberating for less than 2 hours in each case. The overwhelming evidence presented by prosecutors had made the guilt of all family members undeniable, while the systematic nature of their crimes had eliminated any possibility of arguing for reduced charges or sentences. The sentencing phase of the proceedings had attracted even more attention than the trials themselves, as judges had struggled to impose punishments that reflected the unprecedented nature and scope of the family's crimes. The systematic murder of 137 people represented a level of criminal activity that existing legal frameworks had been inadequate to address. The Woodhaven case had demonstrated that evil could operate on a systematic scale while remaining hidden behind respected institutions and charitable activities. The family's ability to maintain their operation for over a decade while enjoying the admiration and support of their community had revealed disturbing truths about society's willingness to overlook warning signs when they contradicted established perceptions about respected individuals. The pursuit of justice for the Woodhaven family's victims had required unprecedented coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies and had established new standards for investigating complex criminal enterprises. The case had proven that systematic crimes could be successfully prosecuted when investigators were willing to challenge powerful and well-connected suspects while building comprehensive cases based on physical evidence and witness testimony. The final chapter of the Woodhaven family's reign of terror concluded in the autumn of 1886 with sentences that reflected the unprecedented nature of their crimes, while the aftermath of their exposure continued to reverberate throughout American society for decades to come. The legacy of their systematic murders would fundamentally change how law enforcement, medical institutions, and charitable organizations operated, creating safeguards designed to prevent such monstrous activities from ever again operating under the protection of respectability and community trust. Judge Marcus Wellington's sentencing of the Woodhaven family members had required careful consideration of punishments appropriate for crimes that exceeded anything in previous American legal experience. Ezra Woodhaven received the death penalty for his role as the architect and leader of the criminal enterprise, with the judge noting that his abuse of religious authority and betrayal of community trust represented aggravating factors that demanded the ultimate punishment. Dr. Samuel Woodhaven's sentence of death by hanging was accompanied by Judge Wellington's observation that his perversion of medical knowledge and systematic torture of victims under the guise of scientific research represented perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the family's crimes. The judge noted that Samuel's medical training, rather than serving as a mitigating factor, actually made his crimes more heinous because he had deliberately used his knowledge to inflict maximum suffering on his victims. Margaret Woodhaven became the first woman in Connecticut history to receive the death penalty when Judge Wellington determined that her role in recruiting victims made her directly responsible for the deaths of over 100 people. The judge's sentencing statement emphasized that Margaret's ability to gain the trust of vulnerable individuals and then deliver them to certain death represented a level of calculated cruelty that transcended traditional gender considerations in criminal sentencing. Constance Woodhaven's sentence of life imprisonment reflected Judge Wellington's recognition that while her role as operational manager made her complicit in all the family's crimes, her detailed record-keeping had ultimately provided the evidence necessary to secure justice for the victims. The judge noted that without Constance's meticulous documentation, many of the family's crimes might have remained unpunished and their victims forgotten. The executions of Ezra, Samuel, and Margaret Woodhaven took place on December 15, 1886, drawing crowds of thousands who had traveled from across New England to witness the end of the family that had terrorized the region for over a decade. The public interest in their executions reflected both the horrific nature of their crimes and the relief that their systematic murder operation had finally been stopped. Constance Woodhaven survived in prison until 1903, spending her final years writing detailed confessions that provided investigators with additional information about the family's crimes and their connections to criminal networks throughout North America and Europe. Her writings revealed that the family had been in communication with similar operations in other locations, suggesting that systematic murder for profit was more widespread than authorities had initially realized. The Woodhaven estate was demolished in 1887, with the property being converted into a memorial park dedicated to the victims of the family's crimes. The memorial included individual markers for each of the 137 identified victims, along with a central monument acknowledging the unknown number of people who might have died at the hands of the family without leaving any record of their fate. The investigation into the corruption networks that had enabled the Woodhaven operation resulted in the prosecution of over 50 officials throughout Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New York who had accepted bribes or provided protection for the family's activities. These prosecutions led to comprehensive reforms in law enforcement oversight and the establishment of new procedures for investigating missing persons cases. The medical institutions that had unknowingly purchased specimens from the Woodhaven operation implemented new procurement standards that required detailed documentation of the sources of all anatomical materials. These reforms established ethical guidelines that fundamentally changed how medical research and education were conducted, ensuring that similar exploitation of murder victims could not occur in the future. The psychological impact of the Woodhaven case extended far beyond the immediate community to influence American understanding of how systematic evil could operate behind facades of respectability. The case became a subject of study for early criminologists and psychologists who were beginning to develop scientific approaches to understanding criminal behavior and preventing similar crimes. Father Michael O'Brien's role in exposing the Woodhaven family's crimes earned him recognition as a pioneer in victim advocacy and criminal investigation. His methodical approach to documenting disappearances and building cases based on witness testimony established models that would be used by law enforcement agencies throughout the country for decades to come. Emma Caldwell's courage in escaping from the Woodhaven estate and providing testimony that led to the family's conviction made her a symbol of survival and justice for victims of systematic crime. Her later work as an advocate for missing persons and vulnerable populations helped establish support systems designed to prevent similar exploitation and provide assistance to those who managed to escape from criminal enterprises. The international implications of the Woodhaven case led to diplomatic agreements for cooperation in investigating crimes that crossed national boundaries, while also establishing new standards for monitoring the international trade in human remains and anatomical specimens. These agreements helped prevent criminal organizations from simply moving their operations to different countries when law enforcement pressure increased in their original locations. The Woodhaven case fundamentally changed how charitable organizations were regulated and monitored, with new requirements for transparency and accountability that made it much more difficult for criminal enterprises to operate under the guise of humanitarian work. These reforms established oversight mechanisms that protected vulnerable populations while ensuring that legitimate charitable activities could continue without unnecessary interference. The legacy of the Woodhaven family's crimes served as a constant reminder that evil could operate on a systematic scale while remaining hidden behind respected institutions and charitable facades. Their case became a cautionary tale about the importance of vigilance in protecting society's most vulnerable members and the need for robust systems to investigate and prevent systematic exploitation and violence. What do you think about this chilling investigation into one of America's most disturbing family crime enterprises? The Woodhaven case remains a stark reminder that the most dangerous predators often hide behind masks of respectability and charitable purpose. Share your thoughts in the comments below about how these historical lessons apply to protecting vulnerable populations today. If you found this deep dive into hidden American history compelling, subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to let these dark chapters remain forgotten. Together, we're ensuring that the victims of systematic crimes like these are remembered and that their stories serve as warnings for future generations. The Woodhaven family's transformation from respected community benefactors to systematic murderers represents one of the most disturbing chapters in American criminal history, demonstrating how wealth, respectability, and charitable work could provide cover for monstrous activities that claimed the lives of 137 innocent people. Their eventual exposure and punishment served justice for their victims while establishing precedents and reforms that continue to protect vulnerable populations more than a century after their crimes were finally brought to light. The story of the Woodhaven family serves as an eternal reminder that vigilance, courage, and the determination to seek truth are essential safeguards against those who would exploit society's most vulnerable members for profit and perverse satisfaction. Their victims, though long deceased, achieved a form of justice through the reforms and protections that emerged from the exposure of systematic evil that had operated for too long behind a facade of Christian charity and community service.